Welcome to the Mikhailovich Show. This is the place where we explore big ideas with people having a big impact on our world. I'm your host, Nick Hilaris, serial entrepreneur, author, early morning riser, and seeker of truth and wisdom. Join me as we explore the journeys and discoveries of fascinating people who are literally unlocking the secrets to creating a life of both success and fulfillment. Each episode will arm you with insights, ideas, and practical perspectives on what it takes not only to be financially and personally successful, but also how to start having authentic impact on the world around you. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Hilaris Show. This week, we are kicking off our summer finance series. Our guest today is Simon Mikhailovich. Simon is the founder of the Bullion Reserve and is a contrarian investor with a very impressive long-term track record. He's also one of the most popular financial commentators in the world. I wanted to have Simon on the show because I think he has an important message to share. Simon is someone who worked at the highest levels of our global financial system and by all measures achieved success. But along the way, he saw some things that were so concerning, he decided to walk away from it all to pursue an alternative path. He's also someone who has a rather unique life perspective. Having grown up in the Soviet Union, he actually has real-world lived experience in something like financial and societal collapse. On top of all this, as you'll see, Simon has a deep understanding of history. What you are about to hear is a fascinating and sobering conversation about the systemic problems in the global economy, the dangerous potential consequences of extreme central bank activism, and the extreme risks we face in the West, both economic and political. Don't worry, though, it's not all gloom and doom. Simon offers some very interesting ideas on both what you can do to protect yourself from these risks and what we can do together as a society to correct our course. As always, thanks for tuning in and hope you enjoy. Today we have a special guest, Simon Mikhailovich, who is the co-founder and the managing partner of the Bullion Reserve and a legend, a contrarian investor legend on Wall Street.
Oh, please, you can't say that. That's not true. No, that's not true.
Thanks for coming on the show. I have been following your work for many years now. I came across you on early Real Vision stuff back in, feels like another era in the pre-COVID era, and have enjoyed learning from you. And this is a treat to get to have you on the show. So thanks for coming.
Happy to be here.
I thought what we could start this conversation is I noticed just recently on Twitter, you had put out a thread on one of the coolest stories from Herodotus about the meeting between Croesus and Solon. And I thought maybe we could just talk about that for a second and what prompted you to put that out there into the internet and engage with Twitter in that way.
I've been trying to catch up on my education, my classics education, which I didn't get in college, and reading stories and Cicero. And there's a great English classicist, Michael Grant, who's written a number of books. So one of the books Michael Grant wrote is, I guess it's a little bit of an anthology of ancient historians, where he selected works from like 20 or 22 different historians and found good translations of small passages that were particularly either relevant to the times or illuminating as to what was going on. And so as I started reading this, so the first one of the early passages in the book was a passage from Herodotus, where he told a story about the meeting of Solon, who was a very astute philosopher and traveler, world traveler by the standards of those times, and Croesus. And Croesus, I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly, but essentially Croesus was famous as a king. He was a king of Lydia, which is now Turkey or part of Turkey. That's where the money came from. King Midas was from the same part of the world. There's a saying, richest Croesus means he was one of the richest people ever. And so the story was essentially Croesus trying to show off to Solon how rich he was. And after he's shown all the wonderful stores of gold and treasures, he asked Solon, is there a more fortunate person that he's ever met? Thinking in all his travels, being a wise man and a traveled man, instead of saying him, Solon went to talk about some guy who had a wonderful family and saw his children grow up, and then saw his grandchildren grow up, and in the end died gloriously in a battle for his country. And what a glory! How fortunate, was his life. Blessed. I'm sorry, he used the word blessed. Croesus was a little disappointed, and he said, "Well, who would be the next most blessed person that you've come across?" Thinking that, of course, now it would be him. And Solon told him some other story about some other guy with a great family and whatever. And then, of course, Croesus was a little more even upset. And he asked, like, what don't you think that I'm fortunate? I mean, look at all this wonderful fortune that I have. And then Solon explained that unless the whole journey has been made, you're just lucky. We don't know if you're fortunate because so many wealthy people lose it before the end of the journey, so that you don't really know if they're fortunate or not. Or in the words of Yogi Berra, it ain't over till it's over. You can't judge the game in the middle until all the innings have been played out. And so I felt that this was a very instructive tale to today's situation and today's financial markets, where we are sort of in this, we'll obviously talk about some of that. I mean, we're in this sort of very unusual period of time where a lot of measures, a lot of standards, a lot of matrix and navigational beacons, if you will, by which for millennia people have measured economic financial success have been dispensed with. And so we are in this. So the question is, are we lucky? Are we just lucky so far? Or have we been fortunate or blessed, in other words? And so my conclusion is that we have been lucky so far. And whether we're blessed or not, time will tell. And obviously, I think we're going to talk about why I think that's the case. But I thought that story from thousands of years ago delivered very much the same message. And what it really goes to show is that while technology changes, historical circumstances change, locations change, the one thing that never changes and has never changed is human nature. That humans make the same mistakes, the same experiences are repeated over and over again. I guess we keep stepping on the same rake over and over and over again. And I think there are reasons for that because of the generational nature and how the next generation, one generation learns lessons and maybe imparts it to their children. By the third generation, nobody remembers and the same mistakes are repeated. And so that was my kind of way of making a point that just because we've been lucky so far doesn't mean we've been blessed. That we will find out in the fullness of time. And I think we're going to find out sooner than later based on how I see things going.
Yeah. And I want to unpack that for sure in this conversation. But let me just wrap up on this Solon Croesus story. I think if I remember right, Croesus actually, his empire gets destroyed, or his kingship gets destroyed with the advance of this dynamic young leader named Cyrus, who's sort of like the predecessor to the Persian Empire kings who attacked the Greek Empire later. So he ended up with a bad ending, which Solon probably saw coming and was warning him.
Absolutely. Solon obviously perceived hubris in this gentleman. And yes, he ended very badly. He lost everything. As it would have. So yes, he was lucky. He was not blessed.
And you never know to the end. Yeah, it's a phenomenal. There's so many cool stories like that. I'm gonna have to check out this historian. I've read a lot of the original text. I spent a lot of my 20s for some reason or another reading the original. I think because my father's from Greece.
There's another great line which I think describes the same situation, and that's from the famous Kenny Rogers song, "The Gambler," where he says, "You don't count your money while you're sitting at the table. There'll be time enough to count when the dealing's done." It's kind of the same thing. You don't count your blessings while you're sitting at the table because you don't really know whether you're going to keep these blessings until the end of the game. Same idea. So the interesting thing is it's the same idea, whether it's Yogi Bear, whether it's Kenny Rogers, or whether it's Herodotus thousands of years ago. Nothing's changed. Same ideas apply. Yes.
Yeah, there's this consistency to human nature and our tendency to make these sort of psychological mistakes. And it's fascinating. One of the things I've been super excited to talk to you about is your experience growing up in the Soviet Union and how that has informed your career as an entrepreneur in the finance world, but in life in general, and how it informs your framework and understanding of the world and the future that we're looking at in terms of the financial markets and our economy and our political systems. I think so few people, at least that I come across, have a context as broad and as unique as that. And I feel like it makes you think differently than most people. So I'd love to spend some time getting into the details of that.
Well, first of all, the story that we just discussed is directly on point in the sense that the reason people repeat the same mistakes over and over again is because previous generations have learned the lessons and they haven't. So I've just been fortunate to have experienced a different environment in many ways, but similar in some ways, which we'll discuss, and saw firsthand what were the implications of these types of conditions, why they lead where they lead, and why people don't see them coming, or the fact that people don't see them coming, even though they're pretty obvious. And so when you ask me the question, how does my childhood in the Soviet Union, what does it have to do with my career in the United States? I would say for the first 30 years, probably not much or nothing other than a desire to succeed and entrepreneurial drive. But I'd say that for the last 20 or so years, it started bearing down on me. And I can give you some examples to understand. First of all, I want to say there's absolutely nothing in common in literal way between the Soviet Union of the 1970s and the United States of today, neither physically nor politically nor environmentally. So the differences are not literal. The differences are more in the meanings and in the signs, in certain signs of things that are treated as normal, but are totally abnormal. So there's a concept. There was a book that was published in the early 2000s. It was a Berkeley professor who was also born in the Soviet Union. It was called "Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More." Of course, he's talking about the Soviet Union, which everybody thought was forever, and then just ended completely by seemingly surprise. But of course, in retrospect, nobody should have been surprised, even though everybody was. The concept that he introduced in that book was hypernormalization. So hypernormalization is essentially it's what it sounds like. It's normalization of abnormal behaviors, conditions, and so forth. And the gist of that condition was that on the one hand, massive propaganda efforts by the government were put forth to convince everybody that what was going on was that things were going the way they should be going, even though they clearly weren't. And even though most people by 70s and especially by 80s in the Soviet Union really got to understand that something was very wrong and that the rhetoric of the government and of the mass media were less and less in line with what was actually happening in their daily lives, they couldn't imagine a different outcome. It just was, it was normalized in there. This was it. It's like you take life as it is, not as you wish it to be. And therefore they continue to behave and cooperate in this abnormal situation as if it were normal, leading to this situation persisting longer than it otherwise would have persisted. Because it's like a cooperation game where everybody agrees that, yes, we know it doesn't make any sense, but we're going to continue doing this because what else are we going to do? Right? And I see this if there is something that's extremely disturbing to me in the parallel that I see, it's that. And let me give you an example. Let me first give you an example of hypernormalization in the Soviet Union, like what was hypernormalized. Well, first of all, the whole economic system, obviously, there was an organization called Gosplan, State Planning Commission, that was a massive building, 250 steps from Kremlin, where they sat and they decided how many shoes were going to be made and which factory was going to make the shoes and how many pairs of pants are people going to need next year and who's going to make these pants and where we're going to make the fabric for the pants and who's going to make the thread, the buttons, and all that. And there were literally thousands of people sitting in this building figuring out all that stuff. And of course, we know from practical experience, we know from what happened, that that's an impossible task, that this is what free market does best, because local people, entrepreneurs driven by their own sort of profit motivation, find needs that they fulfill. And to the extent that some of the needs that they find are not real, and there is no real need or there's no real demand for that need, then those businesses don't prosper. And then resources get reallocated to something else. So you can say that essentially to the extent that the capitalist system, with a lot of issues and a lot of warts and a lot of inefficiencies of its own and some pernicious features of its own, nevertheless, is probably of what we have is the most efficient system of allocating scarce resources based on some rational thinking, which is not always correct, but when it's not correct, it is fairly quickly corrected. The excesses are excised, people lose money, and then the resources are redirected to something more promising and more sensible. What I started observing in this country, and not just in the United States, but in the West in general, is that attempts to manipulate the financial system through not deciding how many pants need to be made, but manipulating the price of money, just one of the manipulations, is perhaps as pivotal to our system as Gosplan was pivotal to the Soviet system. So what do I mean? The Fed basically is Gosplan. It sits there and then decides what is the cost of funds that would make sense in order at some point to stimulate the system to the objective term to not collapse the system. Okay? Because in 2008, it sort of collapsed. So let's step back for a minute. People say, oh, interest rates, yeah, zero interest rate policy, that's suppression, but we need that because we need to let the economy recover. We need to let the banks, rebuild their capital after 2008 and so forth. First of all, rates have been declining since the early 80s. They've only been going down. Okay, they've not been going up. From 2008, they went to zero, and they've essentially stayed at zero until last year, basically just 14 months ago or something like that, when the Fed started raising rates. And the consequences of this operation, people think are nothing, but I think they're quite significant, and they're coming down the pipe very shortly. But let's just focus on this zero interest rate policy and its implications. So two things about that. First of all, the underpinning of the economic science, to the extent it is a science, it's a behavioral science, was described. I have a couple of quotes that I pulled just for this conversation, just so it's not me spouting off, but get some people. So the first concept is scarcity. Economics, the science of economics, is essentially a study of allocation of scarce resources, supply, demand, human behavior, and so forth. Lionel Robbins, who was a famous British economist, lived about the same time as Keynes, was opponent of Keynes. But he defined London School of Economics. He was in the London School of Economics. In 1932, he defined economics as a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means, which have alternative uses. So scarce resources have different uses, and the economics is a study of how humans allocate these scarce resources based on their needs. Okay, well, that's the first concept. The second concept is time value of money, which is it's basically, for people who have never heard it, it's a concept that a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. But in the business of investing, you can't say a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush, because maybe a bird in the hand is better than 1.2 birds in the bush. Or maybe it's 4 birds in the bush. So the entire subject of finance is more or less a quantitative methodology of equating a bird in the hand, which is $1 today, to receiving some cash flow dollars in the future. So the proverbial birds in the bush. And how do we equate one to the other? So how do I make a rational choice? Like we see that in the game shows. Oh, Mr. So-and-so, you've now won $10,000. Would you like to keep $10,000, or would you like to open door number 3 and you have a chance to win $20,000? But if you're wrong, you're going to lose $10,000. But think about this. What if the point was, okay, if you open door number 3, you can make $10,001 and you can lose $10,000. Well, we know what choice everybody would make, right? I mean, they would say, I don't want to bet $10,000 to get another dollar. So there's definitely, at some point, people make a decision, and at the game show, they make an irrational decision usually. It's an emotional decision. But in finance, they try to make a rational decision as to how much money today versus how much money tomorrow, and how do we relate one to the other, okay? And so this is what Investopedia says about the time value of money. It would be hard to find a single area of finance where the time value of money does not influence the decision-making process. The time value of money is the central concept in discounted cash flow analysis, which is one of the most popular and influential methods for valuing investment opportunities. It is also an integral part of financial planning and risk management activities. Pension fund managers, for instance, consider the time value of money to ensure that their account holders will receive adequate funds in retirement. So now imagine that this central pivotal concept and pivotal number that in the free markets has always been determined by supply and demand among market participants, in other words, the collective thinking of all the market participants, has been taken over, this function has been taken over by Gosplan, which is, we call Federal Reserve, financial Gosplan. That decides what is the cost of money, how much money should be available to the banking system, how much money should be available, therefore, to the capital markets to fund projects, and at what price. So if this is the underpinning of the entire financial analysis, if this is what pension fund managers use to determine whether they're going to have enough money when people are going to retire, please consider that if this number is rigged to zero, set to zero, what is the output of all the financial analysis that's performed in the Western world for the past 15 years? And what relation to reality does it bear if the inputs are wrong? Now, people would immediately say, yeah, nice to say that, very theoretical, doesn't mean anything. The markets are up. You could have made a fortune while you're, spouting this doom speak and all that. So let's bring this idea to a concrete situation, right? What is really the point of investing and saving? Not necessarily for money managers who generate fees from doing that and sometimes end up winning regardless of whether their clients win or lose because they rake off the fee. It's a fee business. It's not necessarily the ultimate results business. But what is a normal saver, a person, or even a business person who is not in the financial business, but they have a company? And so they have a pension plan and they're creating, security for themselves and for their family, the golden years, the retirement. That's for most people from say 25 to 65, that's a 40-year project. So if we're thinking in terms of a journey, this is like a trip to some star. This is not even going across the ocean, because if you have wrong beacons, if the beacons are rigged, or if the celestial navigation system is wrong, or whatever, or you can't see the stars, you can't navigate. Okay, so in a month, when you don't reach land, you're going to find out that you are in the wrong place, or you're going to reach the wrong part of land. But you're in a 40-year trip, so you can be wrong for 25 years and you don't know it. So in real navigation, when you can't see the stars in navigational beacon, there's a methodology called dead reckoning. Dead reckoning is simply it's extrapolation. Now, in investing world, it's called trend following. It all has corollaries. So what's a trend following? It's we extrapolate what happened before to where we're going, right? So all we do is we find the last spot on the map where we think we know we were. We put a cross there. We put an X there. And then we measure essentially how miles an hour we're going and in what direction we're going. And we're just extrapolating these points. Now, if we don't ever bring the map location to the real location by taking the reading of the sun with a sextant in the old days, or GPS in today's world, we really are trusting that this chart shows where we are, where in fact we can't tell where we are, and because there's ocean all around us, we don't know where we are, okay? Well, your financial statement of your 40-year trip from college to retirement is essentially a map that for the past 20 years has been set by dead reckoning without any taking of the readings from the outside world to determine where it really is or ought to be in the normalized conditions. And what are normalized conditions? Normalized conditions for finance or for financial values are conditions where risk is priced based on collective wisdom of the market, not based on collective wisdom of people sitting in the Federal Reserve building or European Central Bank building, because they're not doing it based on wisdom. They're doing it based on policy objectives, which their objective is to keep the game going at whatever cost. It doesn't matter. A failure is not an option. That's their policy. And what is a failure? A failure is repricing of financial assets to reflect the true time value of money, to find the projects where capital has been misallocated, that cannot repay the debt. Now, we know intuitively that there are a lot of projects that can never repay the debt. I mean, we know that in the tech world, there are tons of companies that are billion whatever valuations that have never made any money, and potentially they will never make any money. I mean, some of them may make money, but a lot of them won't make money. And yet they're selling for bazillion dollars. And the same thing with a lot of NFTs and cryptocurrencies and Rolex watches and a lot of other things that you can imagine. So the problem that I see with where we are today versus where I was in the Soviet Union as a 20-year-old when we left is we came to the conclusion, by we, I mean my father and I primarily, that this game or this system had no future because it didn't make any sense. It just didn't make sense. The officials were corrupt, and the elites were basically stealing and perpetuating the myth that we're all going to some bright communist future, where in fact they were just loading up on whatever they could as fast as they could to improve their own lives. Now, I don't know if any of this sounds familiar to anybody, but it certainly sounds familiar to me. So you have an unsustainable path. You have an economic infrastructure system that is based on false assumptions, or faulty assumptions. Everybody's cooperating in this game, if you will. But you know that eventually gravity takes hold and the whole thing ends. You just don't know how or when. And so that's basically what led me to, after the 2008 crisis, to kind of change my thinking completely when I realized that no, the authorities are not going to let the capitalist system work its whatever free market system work its way. By the way, this is not, when I say capitalism, this is not an ideological statement. It's simply, it's a system, it's a harsh system for allocating scarce resources. Okay? It may need to be augmented by some social spending and some other things to keep the peace among the population. But the system itself works the way it works. So when you disable the key workings of that system, when you take the GPS that guides that system and not let people see the output, but you fake the output, you put out their own coordinates. So people think they're going in some direction. They're in fact not going in that direction, and they're going in a completely opposite direction. That to me is a path to nowhere. And that's where I think the biggest insight from all this is that, well, the biggest insight from all this, that these things don't last. There's an ample history of societies. There are different books that describe it. That's why history is cyclical. That's why generations, the generational nature of having to relearn the same lessons. It's just the way humans are. And I think we are in the, whatever, if you want to use the fourth turning analogy, we are in the fourth turning, or we are in the 100-year debt super cycle, whatever you want to say. We're in the last throes of that. And that was, I guess, the best thing for me, that I was able to take my Soviet experience, early life Soviet experience, and see the signs. The pattern recognition is what it is. See the signs that we are in a similar place. And again, I'm not comparing the United States to the Soviet Union. I'm comparing systemic tells, if you will, telltales that I'm observing, which are the same in all systems, whether it's the Soviet Union, the United States, or the British Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Russian Empire, or any empire, all of which, as we know, are now gone, and didn't know they were going until after they're gone.
Hey guys, this is Nick. I wanted to take a quick break from the episode to share some exciting news. In addition to the podcast, I want to make you aware of some additional content we're putting out. And best of all, it's 100% free. Our Profit Plus newsletter consists of weekly insights about what it takes to find meaning in the pursuit of modern success. This is the place where we explore big ideas at the intersection of markets, business, politics, and life, as we seek to empower our readers to have an authentic impact on the world. If you're serious about finding fulfillment amid success, then definitely check out these additional insights. Just go to subscribe.nickhilaris.com. Again, that's subscribe.nickhilaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. Before we get into the implications of this idea and this framework that you have, I'd like to go back into it because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to cover about the financial system and history. So if we take your model of a world in which the GPS system of capitalism is being manipulated and potentially causing the fortunes of the citizens of the West, but the governments as well, citizens, corporations, governments, to think they're more prosperous than they are, right? That's just to summarize at a high level.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So it's clear to me, I've only been relatively young. I've only been in this capitalism game for 20 something years, but clearly in my lifetime, there's no question that the Federal Reserve and these central banks have been engaging in the manipulation of interest rates. But I'm curious, weren't they doing that before as well? In the post, let's just take from post World War II, weren't the Feds, the central banks of the world, messing around with interest rates there? And what changed in 2008 that turned the amplification up on the manipulation?
Well, as you correctly point out, I mean, there's a nexus between interest rates, a capacity to borrow, yeah, and the value of the currency, of the U.S. currency. The reason this situation is highly pernicious, not just because everything is mispriced, but because there are social implications. Because when people essentially lose everything, they lose it sometimes. And that's how revolutions happen and social unrest and so forth. The reason I think before it wasn't as existentially important is because there was a vibrant economy that essentially paid for itself. The United States after World War II was the largest creditor nation in the world. We had massive manufacturing base. The well-being of the people by all objective measures from the Great Depression into, let's say, to the 1960s was improving. We know that the 50s, there may have been boring time of conformity, but they were economically very prosperous, and so were the early 60s. And so you could tweak these things on the margins and not disturb the core value of the entire economy. Somewhere starting from the 1980s, after Volcker raised the rates and then the rates started falling down, generally we could start with Reaganomics, I guess. It didn't become apparent to people, but in retrospect, I think it becomes apparent that the economy was no longer producing improved living standards for people without subsidizing consumption with credit. So if you look at all the statistics, at all the charts, you will see from the early 1980s, debt started growing at a much faster rate than the economy, which is the GDP. That speaks to the increased leverage in the system. So in a sense, I know people say that personal finances are not like government finances, but just for this for this example, you can say that if a person makes, I don't know, whatever, $100,000 a year, one year they spend 100,000, then they spend 101, 102, 103, 104, and they keep borrowing this additional money. They don't make any more money, or they make maybe 102, but they're spending now 105, and then they make 105, but they're spending 112, and so on and so forth. So in nominal terms, their income is growing, but their expenditures are growing even faster. Now, you can understand that in a human situation, family situation, you're going to run into serious trouble pretty soon. In the government situation, you're going to run into serious trouble much, much later. Because government, particularly a government like government of the United States, which is a hegemonic superpower, has tremendously deep credibility reserve, right? And so even though its financial position on paper have been deteriorating for 40 years, it wasn't sufficiently dire for anybody to worry about it. And so this has continued going on. And so we've been in a situation where the interest rates are not reflecting the real cost of capital, right? It means resources are getting misallocated. And in order to make up for this waste of resources, we are borrowing or printing and borrowing from ourselves additional money to patch these holes and to make it look like the economy is growing. And the economy is growing. I want to make people understand. This is fictional, but it's not fiction. It's fictional in the sense that it's not sustainable. The fiction is sustainability. The results are real. Just like if you have a real American Express where you're charging champagne and fancy trips and all this stuff, the trips are real. Champagne is real. The money that you're spending is real, but it's not yours. It's coming from somebody else. And that somebody else is willing to subsidize you seemingly indefinitely. And that's kind of the thesis that's been going on around that, yeah, all this is happening, but it's been going on for 40 years. And even though it doesn't make sense, it will go on forever because because Tina, there's no alternative, right? You probably heard that. There's no alternative, right? The dollar, there's no alternative to the dollar. There's no alternative to stocks. We have to own stock because there's nothing else to own. We have to do this. We have to do that. So that's what hypernormalization is. Everybody realizes that there's something abnormal about it. And yet, like in some sort of a mutual suicide pact, if you will, they continue to behave in a way that perpetuates this abnormal system until it comes to an end. And the question is always like, why would it ever come to an end? What would ever make it come to an end? And usually the problems that bring it to the end it's a combination of crises, in which I believe we are very well, which I think all of which I believe are very well underway. And that is there's economic problems, which we have because we now have this massive amount of debt. The interest rates have been risen. We have not seen attempts to refinance this pile of debt at 6, 7, 8% instead of 2, 3, 4%. Okay? So this is very early. The difference between equities and credit is in equities, everything happens very quickly because it's all based on expectations. In credit, it's like, give me my money. but it's not due for a while. So until it's due, it seems to be no problem. But once it's due, then we're going to find out. And I think that's coming down the pike pretty quickly. The other problem is geopolitical problem. I mean, the United States, this ability to manipulate interest rates without destroying the currency and without setting off massive inflation has been based on a very particular set of circumstances, particularly since the 1990 or 92 collapse of the Soviet Union, when the United States emerged as a hegemonic power. The United States currency has emerged as the global reserve currency, where most of the commodities are traded and priced in dollars. And so people or countries out there who are commodity consumers have to have dollars in order to buy these commodities from people who are commodity producers. And so if commodity consumers pay for the purchases in dollars, then people who sell commodities end up with these dollars. And what do they do with the dollars? Well, they typically buy U.S. treasuries. That's the surplus. So they have their surpluses, their profits that are parked in U.S. treasuries because that's how they get paid. They get paid in the dollars. So this system, in combination with the outsourcing, globalization, and outsourcing of production of consumer goods to primarily China or third world, has been, on one hand, creating, it's not artificial, it's organic, but very special circumstances. Demand for the U.S. dollars, massive demand for the U.S. dollars outside the United States, enabling the United States to borrow, to essentially rig the rates, and then borrow at these rigged rates. And I would say that similar situation exists in the European Union. They have had their negative return bonds. By the way, there's a book called The History of Interest Rates by, I forgot the name of one author. One author's name is Silla. Studied 4,000 years of history, 4,000 years worth of interest rate history. There's no mention in that book of negative interest rates. That's because it's never happened before. So for good reasons, because it doesn't make any sense. But here we are, hypernormalization. It doesn't make any sense, but everybody has been convinced that somehow it makes sense, and they're behaving this way. So what I've just enumerated, globalization, ability to outsource manufacturing to much cheaper manufacturing base, right, which keeps inflation in check, massive demand for U.S. dollars outside the United States, which allows the United States to keep selling the dollars, raising, essentially borrowing money to subsidize its own economy and its own population, right, at wrong rates. That's what enabled this game to continue for as long as it has continued. These conditions are coming to an end. We have geopolitical conflict, which is very much centered around the dollar and the control that the United States exercises. The United States has used, one thing to mention is that this demand for dollars around the world has been leveraged by the United States as part of its power projection. So control over the global financial system and the fact that everybody around the world has to use the dollars to pay for commodities has enabled the United States to declare extraterritorial jurisdiction. Typically, a jurisdiction of a country is within its borders. And then, of course, if something happens between countries, there is international law, and you have to go to the Court of International Law to settle those disputes. But what the United States has maintained is because the dollar is the United States currency, and because ultimately all dollar transactions clear through the Fed, the United States has jurisdiction anywhere in the world on any transaction involving US dollars. And so that has become a point of political leverage where, let's say, sanctions against Iran or sanctions against Russia, where we don't want our dollars used. We can punish people. We can close their bank accounts, even in foreign banks. Because, again, if foreign trade involves dollars, then even dollar accounts in foreign banks are subject to U.S. jurisdiction and to U.S. sanction. Well, unfortunately, I think we've pulled this one time too many. What has reared its ugly head is something called counterparty risk, which is essentially defined as the risk that one or more parties in a transaction does not fulfill its obligations. So in a financial transaction where, let's say, you are some country and you have reserves in dollars and they're kept in a Western bank, just like Russia had reserves in dollars and kept it in the Western bank, the United States decided that we don't like Russia and we don't like the politics of Russia, and therefore we're going to take their money. Well, okay, so there are a lot of countries around the world where maybe 80% of the population resides that are not part of the Western alliance directly, and that are looking at it and have been looking at it and said, well, if I disagree with the United States or Western Europe and they just take my money, then maybe I shouldn't keep so much money in their banks. And so So the one underpinning of the system that I've been describing has been continuous demand for US dollars. And many people in the West will tell you that that's never going away because Tina, there's no alternative. Well, okay. Cuba has been under sanctions since 1959. I was born in 1959. That's 64 years ago. Well, Cuba has been cut out of the global financial system, but it hasn't slipped under the waves. Neither has Iran. So there are other ways of doing business. So it's one thing when outlier states like Cuba or Iran are forced into the situation, but all of a sudden Russia is forced into the situation, which, by the way, is the largest or second largest supplier of commodities around the world, both agricultural and petrochemical commodities and all kinds of metals and so forth. And the next thing, people like India and China and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Brazil are looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we're going to be next. So the support for US dollar is slowly, it's not an overnight thing. It's hard to replace, but it's slowly declining. And that ultimately reduces the ability of the Fed and the US government to borrow without limits, without triggering dollar devaluation, inflationary spiral, and things like that, which has happened. Like if we were Argentina, we would have been there decades ago. So it's all about credibility. Credit is the word credit, is about credere. Credere in Latin means belief. So it's about belief. So the United States has tremendous credibility reserve. But boy, have we been digging a hole for ourselves, and we keep doing it. So geopolitical situation where China, Russia, and other non-aligned countries are suddenly challenging the United States primacy, not to replace the United States as a hegemonic power, but to simply not have the United States as a hegemonic power over them. It's called multipolarity. So we have that going on. We have a war going on, hot war. And in history, throughout history, wars have been highly inflationary. They're extremely expensive. And of course, they're not productive because you're literally burning up the money that you're spending on ammunition, right? I mean, it's literally being spent in order to explode. There's nothing left. Not only is there no munitions left for which you paid, but the ground, the buildings that are destroyed and all that's destroyed. So there's a tremendous destruction of value that then needs to be replaced, and that's hugely inflationary. We have a major reorganization because of this, a major pending reorganization of supply chain, which is extremely expensive and also inflationary. All these things I'm describing to you are sort of like margin calls. They're like these little margin calls on different areas of our economic firmament, if you will. Okay. So what's the story with supply chains? Well, 2 weeks ago, or within the last 2 weeks, Raytheon, which is a number 2, 3, 4, whatever defense contractor in the United States, the CEO has come out and said we can't decouple from China. We have 1,000 plus suppliers in there. It will take years and years for us to decouple from China. Okay, so we have a tense international situation where we hear all kinds of saber rattling from DC and from Beijing about potential conflict between China and the United States, both related to Taiwan, related to growing Chinese influence around the world. But the United States military industry is dependent on Chinese suppliers. So how are we going to fight the war with the country that makes our weapons or makes components for our own weapons that we're going to need to use to fight them? Well, that doesn't work. We're going to have to, quote unquote, de-risk our supply chain. What does that mean? Well, it means bringing it to either some friendly countries or closer to home. Well, that's very expensive. I mean, that's hugely expensive. That's inflationary. That's a problem. Political discord. Okay, we're not going to get into that, but I don't think you need to explain to anybody that polarization in the United States, domestic political situation, has been probably the last time we saw this was maybe 1920s, and the last time we saw before that was 1850s and 60s. So Civil War and the labor disputes, Pinkertons breaking legs of Ford workers, massive demonstrations. I read recently there were apparently in the 1920s or teens, there was I don't know if you call it uprising, but 15,000 miners, apparently armed with rifles, were battling strikebreakers in the United States. This was the largest military insurrection in the history of the United States outside of Civil War. Never heard of that, but obviously it's something that happened. So we have that going on. So we have the internal political divisions. We have a geopolitical crisis. We have financial and economic difficulty because we've been relying on these subsidized money and subsidized consumption by growing additional debt. enabled by the constantly declining interest rates, which are now rising. We have natural disasters, we have global warming, and we have other things. And then we of course, we have a pandemic, which has cost tremendous amount of money and caused tremendous increase in debt and all kinds of social consequences, work from home and other things, which we're still figuring out. We don't even know how this is all going to play out. You and I talked before, commercial real estate. I mean, what does this all do to office space? What is it? I mean, this is a multi-trillion-dollar asset class. And the important thing to understand about everything I'm saying is that every dollar of debt, every single dollar of debt is somebody's asset. So all this debt, when people talk about jubilee, debt jubilee, that means canceling assets. It's not just canceling obligations. It's also canceling assets. So who owns the assets? Oh, the pension funds own the assets. Insurance company own the assets. 401ks own these assets. So the money didn't come from the billionaires, which of course it also came from the billionaires. But all these trillions came from the populations, from the people. And again, what happens to the population when they lose all their money? They lose it. So this is a very dangerous situation, both financially, socially, geopolitically, and in every sense of the way. Worse probably than the Soviet Union in a way, because Soviet Union was contained within the Soviet Union. This is a global situation.
It's exacerbated by what we started this conversation on. Just to give a tangible example of what I mean by that is, so if you take the underlying thesis of your GPS analogy, the manipulation of interest rates, couple that with what I do for a living, which is invest and develop real estate projects. They manipulated interest rates for so long that the entire stock of commercial real estate in the world going into COVID and during COVID was trading at valuations that were completely predicated on interest rates being zero forever. So you had multifamily assets, in California trading at a 3% cap. So 3 cap makes sense if interest rates are zero, but you're completely underwater if interest rates are 5. And it's causing pain already. Offices here in LA are down 50%. And like you said, each one of these assets or each one of these debt situations is also an asset. So who owns these offices? Well, the pension funds own them. And the pension funds have made a whole bunch of promises to people, mostly in your generation and government workers. They're going to have a hard time meeting their actuarial returns and fulfilling those promises without additional government intervention. And I don't know how that which might end up happening. We live in a crazy enough world where politicians might try to create money out of thin air to plug the gaps in the pension system, but
they have been doing it. They have been creating. That was my point. They've been creating money out of thin air through all these different mechanisms. We call them ZERP, we call them QE, we call them Operation Twist or Operation whatever. These are all fancy names for money printing. That's what they are, for creation of credit and money. And when you create out of nowhere and endlessly credit and money, you devalue credit and money. It's no longer a scarce resource. So we're in this moment of great danger and great opportunity for some people, because you can switch, because it's while everybody thinks it's real, right? But it's only real for a few people. It's only real if 5 people want to sell something. If 5 million people want to sell something, that price doesn't exist. And so until the moment of clarity sets in, which it always does, there's an opportunity to do something about it. Whereas once that happens, there's no opportunity to do anything about it. But most people are not thinking about it this way, and they're not doing anything. And the ironclad lesson of history, the studies have been done. There's a professor at Connecticut College, also was born and grew up in the Soviet Union, came here when I did in the 1970s, and basically his entire career has been here, Peter Turchin, who wrote a book, War and Peace and War, and he just came out another book called The End Times, where he goes through, they've studied numerous, over 1,000 years, numerous economic and historical cycles. It's an ironclad of history that pre-crisis elites, the vast majority of the pre-crisis elites, do not see what's coming. They never see what's coming. One thing about the Soviet Union, I was in the Soviet Union, I left in 1978. This is like 14 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. I went back with my wife, who's an American, and I wanted to show her how it was. In 1988, So this was 4 years before everything collapsed. Well, things were bad, but if you think that I did, or my high school friends there, of course, whom I saw at the time, think anybody had any idea that what was going to happen would happen? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Everybody thought it makes no sense and it's just going to keep going because that's how it is. That's the way it's been through the whole life. We are now in a situation where this has been going on for 40 years. This is 2 generations of investors, 15 years of zero interest rates, a full generation of investors. If I just read to you the definition of time value of money, which is the pivotal input into all financial decisions, and it's been totally messed up for 15 years, people don't know what that means. They don't know how to apply it. Because even those older investors who know what it means, in order to stay in the investment business, you got to play the game. You can't just say, this is all makes no sense. Fine, retire then, if it doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, you have to play the game. It's like if you're a professional gambler and casino has rigged the wheel, you still have to play. Otherwise, you're out of a job, out of a career. So find a way to de-rig it, or find a way to take advantage of the rigging or something. And that's what's been going on. That is what's coming to an end because of the objective outside forces, which is why it always comes to an end. Because in the end, objective outside forces intervene, and something that made no sense but kept on going, it stops.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode of The Nick Halera Show is brought to you by Metros Capital. If you're an investor looking for direct access to real estate investments, then we'd love to talk with you. Investment opportunities at Metros Capital balance financial returns and community impact. To learn more, contact us at metros.nikhaleris.com. Again, that's metros.nikhaleris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. One of the things that concerns me just as an observer of politics, and I have some friends who sort of made it into elected office, and I know some politicians here in LA, is there appears to be like a profound lack of understanding of the financial architecture, the financial system, and these historical trends, which you've articulated so well here. And the point you made earlier about America's exorbitant privilege with the reserve currency and how that has allowed us to do what we've done, how that's allowed us to incur all these debts without having a runaway currency situation like in Argentina. I think there's very few people in leadership in this country that understand that. And given the fact they don't understand it, they don't see the fact that it's changing before their eyes as a result of the sanctions, the weaponization of the US dollar in the last, 10 years, let's say. And that's kind of scary to think about. We have leaders who just not even clued into the idea that countries like China, which are massive, are busy making their own arrangements. They're buying gold. They're cutting trade deals, bilateral trade deals, trying to settle trade in their currency. The world is changing really fast right before our eyes at this moment.
Again, if you read Turchin and you read about the cycles, it's impossible to blame people. Even though I sort of like they're fiduciaries and they should be better, but it's hard to blame people because the authority of the state has been thrown behind some massive fallacy, if you will. Massive fallacy, like epic fallacy. We have never been in this situation before. We have been in similar situations many times. We have never been in a situation that's this big before. And that's because of technology. It's sort of like nuclear weapons. Like you can think the war in the context of spears and the cavalry and swords. And then you have mechanized infantry, and then you have tanks and planes, and then you have rockets, and now you have nuclear weapons. I mean, it's a completely different scale of impact of wrong decisions. Bad decisions have completely different level of consequences than they've ever done in the past. And so how can you blame politicians who are not financial professionals to begin with? It's like they would sound like me, crazy people. What are they talking about? This is like doom porn. But it isn't, unfortunately. It's what it is. And so, yeah, I can talk about it. I've been talking about it I really came to these conclusions before the last financial crisis. And I thought that the 08 was going to be the market clearing event. that capitalism would be allowed to work, at least to some extent. But no, essentially, I thought initially we doubled down. I think we quadrupled down on what didn't make any sense. And now we've brought it 15 years forward. It doesn't make sense. And now third parties are calling us out on. Christine Lagarde was talking to I forgot where she was talking in New York in February or something. I mean, she said that the world is. Well, the reason I'm quoting these people is because I can say it all, but what credibility do I have? And these people from the government, I'm not taking their cues on what to do, but their observations as to what's going on. Sometimes they tell the truth. Sometimes they don't mean to say it, but they say it. So she said the world is breaking up into trading zones and trading blocks. If anybody really steps back, takes a minute, and takes this woman at her word. And by the way, Yellen was talking and saying the same thing. We need to de-risk our supply chain. We need to go friendshoring. So politicians are saying these things so that perhaps later they can say, we were saying that. Think the implications. What does it mean that there would be different trading blocks and there would be different reserve currencies in these trading blocks? Well, then what is the demand for the US dollar? Well, it's less. It's not zero. It's just less. And if it's less, can we still print all this money? Can we continue to subsidize? And I don't know if anybody noticed, but the deficits that used to be in the tens of billions and then in hundreds of billions are now running into thousands of billions, which is trillions, as a routine. So the numbers keep growing. We've seen inflation in food. We've seen inflation in a lot of things. But when you compare it to the amount of money outstanding, the dollar is probably still king compared to what it would be if it were some currency of a regular country that didn't have the credibility that we have. So here we are.
Yeah, your idea, well, I guess it's not your idea, but for now it's your idea, the hyper-normalization idea. I see it manifested in a huge way in this country when it comes to the narrative around inflation. I started writing about this actually in the pre-COVID days and in the pre-inflation run-up, which is everyone was talking about how there was no inflation. The problem was too little inflation at the time. But anyone who was trying to buy a house or rent an apartment in a decent city was experiencing massive inflation that wasn't being picked up. And I feel like that's a really good example of the idea of hypernormalization, which is if you mess around with reality or an important component of reality like interest rates, you get yourself into a situation where you have to manufacture fake statistics in a way that don't reflect reality. So like the Fed's owner's equivalent rent didn't pick up urban inflation for 15 years. And only now is starting to show in the last 2 years, it started to show inflation. But to me, that seemed like a good example of the problem of hypernormalization.
Right. Well, okay. So you're bringing a very important point. And that is financial professionals and politicians, they look at these numbers, CPI. It's a basket. It's a basket of goods that is determined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They rig the basket to show whatever they wanted to show and political number. But it's not it's not a conspiracy theory. So if you go and just look at the inflation in housing, education, and healthcare, it's disclosed. It's not a secret that there's been massive inflation at the rate of 7-8% a year for many, many years in these areas. Now, if you then think, what are the factors that determine well-being of a society? It's living in a decent housing. It's having access to good education and having access to decent healthcare. I mean, T-shirts from Walmart are important up to a point. Flat screen TVs are important up to a point. Cars are important up to a point. But the quality of life and the feeling of people that they're living a decent life has a lot to do with access to education, access to quality housing, and access to quality healthcare. And there's been massive inflation in those areas, which has not been captured at all in the statistic. And you can see why that was a policy-driven inflation, because housing controlling interest rate overinflates housing. Student loans, $1.5 trillion of student loans, guaranteeing student loans overinflates education, right? Because there's a debt subsidized demand for a scarce resource, which means that the resource keeps getting more and more expensive, right? And the healthcare, I mean, I mean, I don't know whatever happened to this rule, but there was a time when George Bush, I think, negotiated with the drug companies that Medicare couldn't even negotiate drug prices. So drug prices in the United States, orders of magnitude higher than everywhere else in the world, because the government just pays whatever the pharma industry asks for, right? So so behind all this, these are not accidental phenomena. These are phenomena, they're different from different parts of this conundrum, if you will, but they're all somehow tied to ill-advised policies with far-reaching, horrible consequences, which the politicians who are on a 2-year or 4-year or 6-year, if they're senators, cycle, they're not thinking in those terms. They should be, they used to, but they're not thinking in those terms. They're just looking at the election cycle. And of course, with social media, forget the election cycle. That's 24-hour news cycle. It's the narrative, right? It's all about the narrative. It's controlling the narrative. So this is a collision of financial realities with political expedience, long-term financial. So I started talking about the charts and where you're on the chart. So if you're on a intergalactic journey and 30 years in, you've been flying in the wrong direction, you may not discover for 30 years that you've been flying in the wrong direction. Everything, all equipment is telling you you're just full speed ahead, doing great, making great progress, going to be there any minute, right? And then retirement comes, baboom. And the savings that you think you were going to have, you don't have. So I can tell you that the consequences of that in the Soviet Union were that the life expectancy of males after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which means that most middle-aged people lost their careers and jobs and couldn't find their place in the new economy. Retired people were given penury-type subsidies to basically eat potatoes. 57. The life expectancy dropped to 57, 57, from 75 or 72 or 73. It's back now. So just people were dying from heart attacks and from misery. So the consequences of these things are real. I'm just afraid that we're going to see something like this, which is, I hope we don't. It's possible to avoid it. The way to avoid it is for politicians to step back like they did in the 1920s. We did suffer through the Great Depression, but the politicians essentially recut the social contract where they allowed more money, this wealth inequality, to be redistributed. Massive amounts of wealth people lost their money during that period of time. It's a massive reallocation of wealth. So all the top 10% or whatever that today bidding up luxury watches and Louis Vuitton in every city and all that, that's a massive haircut for that population and for those businesses. That's what we're looking at. I believe, I should say.
Yeah. So in your view, the way that a country like America could unwind itself from all these imbalances that they created by manipulating interest rates is to engage in like New Deal type activities like FDR.
It's a combination of controlled demolition with New Deal type activities. See, the problem is that's a solution to the immediate problem, but that creates other long-term problems, like New Deal created, right? It created Social Security, which was a great idea, which is a great idea, but humans managed to screw up every project over the long term. I mean, that's just what happens. That's why there's no company that's 500 years old. That's why financial assets from the Renaissance are not still trading on the exchanges. That's why the Medicis are not the richest people in the world, because there's a cyclicality to all this. Oh, and the one thing I didn't mention, we have to talk about that tremendous technological revolution that's going on. We've had a massive revolution over the past 20 years, which has not been accompanied by a massive credit cycle that usually happens when this level of change happens. We went from no internet to essentially internet over the last 30 years. And everything that brings in communications revolution, we have not seen full fallout. I mean, we've seen things like Kodak and companies like that, Polaroid or whatever. There are some examples of that. Now we're starting to see retail like Bed Bath & Beyond. But I mean, compared to the quantum of change, to the quantum of defaults, it's non-commensurate. There are clearly a lot more companies that wouldn't be in business but for the zero interest rates and all the debt that's out there. And so if we're looking at from now forward, I mean, just to give you one last thing on this point. If you think 1913, so the year before World War I, and if you think the level of technology, 1913, just rudimentary internal combustion engine, just Model T. Wright brothers just flew a few years before their first whatever, by plane. It's mostly horse and buggy. Yes, there's telegraph. So fast forward 30 years, 1945, 32 years. You have nuclear weapons, atomic bomb, jet engines. You have transatlantic fast ships instead of taking 2 weeks, going 7 days, can cross the Atlantic. You have cars, you have television, radio, movies, washing machines, different world, right? And at the same time, two world wars. Every empire has collapsed. Russian Revolution, massive, massive change. So I think that we are in a period similar to that, where this AI and biotech, there are massive, massive breakthroughs that we're watching right now in the way we live, in the way we're going to be live, communicate, deal with each other, conduct business. And people think it's wonderful, and it is wonderful. But let's not forget, this is massively disruptive. It's disruptive to the legacy wealth, it's disruptive to the legacy industry, to the society, the way it's organized today, whose jobs, who's going to be better off, who's going to be worse off. So these types are, and it's all coming together with too much debt, incorrect navigational signals. Now you're 40 years or 30 years into this project. Now they're going to tell you, you know what? That pension you've been accumulating for 30 years, it's not going to be there. We're still in a democracy, sort of. So how people are going to vote? Who are they going to vote for? Trump squared? That's what people need to be thinking about. That's where all this is coming from. It's not coming from a personality of Trump or from a personality of Biden. These conflicts are coming from within the society and are being expressed through these persons who some people love and some people hate. But there's a much bigger story underneath.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like in times past, right, the feature of technological innovation that is common in these other eras, even in the 19th century, is that there's a whole bunch of destruction that goes alongside these things. So they're financially painful for the people that are involved in them. But then you come out on the other side of it and the economy is more productive. And what's happened in my career, essentially, I started working in 2001 and been bailing out companies since then.
Oh, we didn't even get into that. We didn't even talk about that. The whole bailout culture. That, you see, the lesson of '08 is exactly the opposite of what it should have been. The lesson of '08 should have been, if you get too far out ahead of your skis, you're going to break your neck. Instead, if you get too far out of the government is going to pick you up and take you down the mountain and put you in a hotel, straight into the hot tub, so you don't have to worry about skiing down, with a blizzard. That's the lesson, which is the opposite lesson. And that's basically how I came to gold, because gold is the anti everything that we're talking about. And that's why nobody wants it, or not nobody, but very few people in the Western world want it, because it's too simple. It's not complicated. It's anti-complexity. It's anti-financial engineering. It's anti-hypernormality. It's the abnormalized normality. So things that are abnormal have been normalized, and things that are normal have been abnormalized. And one of those things is gold. It's not a human project. That's why it's still around 5,000 years or 10,000 years later, because humans are not involved in it. It's an element. It's a token, if you will, in today's parlance, that's not connected to the grid. I mean, that's not connected to the network. It depends on no one. It has no counterparty. It's no one's promised to do anything. It's just a thing. So the value of a thing like that, which it just happens to be the most liquid, the governments use it for reserve. You could talk about art. You can talk about collectibles. You can talk about even real estate property, in a sense that if you don't leverage it, if you don't financialize a attractive property, land in the middle of Los Angeles is extremely valuable, has been for years. And I suspect after this is all over, it will still be extremely valuable. The question is, if you financialized it, if you levered it, are you going to keep the title to it? But if you can keep the title to it, these are real assets that they've not been financialized, and they're not been driven into the same bubble that everything else. They're anti-bubble assets in some way. That's what led me to gold. It's a way for me. I thought it was a way for me and for other people to find a safe harbor. Sailing is my hobby, so I use these analogies quite a bit. Is to find a safe harbor in a storm. It's not that you're not going to get buffeted there, but you're not going to sink. And the objective here should be not to sink through all this, because whoever doesn't sink will come out way ahead, because in the land of the blind, one-eyed man is king. So if you have more than others, your purchasing power relative to others decreases dramatically, and then you can maintain or maybe even improve your situation compared to people who have not thought about that. It's a tool. There are other tools, but that's a tool that I found. That's kind of what happened to me in my thinking in coming to this idea is what do I do to decorrelate from all this? Like if this whole system is so crazy, like what's not crazy? Not a lot of things are not crazy because most of the things get financialized. When you could borrow money to buy Rolex watch collection.
Yeah, even gold. And what is cool about your story and your decision after '08 is that you sort of put your money where your mouth is in a big way and pivoted from a sort of financial career in a sense to creating a business which allows investors to obtain access to gold in a non-financialized way.
But it's only because I've seen this happen. It's like when the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you realize that I've seen this movie before and I've already been at an airport with $100 in my pocket in a suitcase and a white piece of paper that's a refugee travel document, no citizenship. I don't want to be there again. That gives you a lot of courage to do things other people can't even imagine doing. You know what I mean? Just exit a successful business and say, you know what, I've eaten enough. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to go do something else. It's only the experience, having lived through that already once, that forces you into this path. So I can't take credit for like this incredible courage. It's fear, the greatest motivator of men. Yes, the greatest motivator of men. Yeah.
From the outside looking in, it's courageous, and your story is inspiring. My father's an immigrant, but he immigrated under totally different circumstances. My understanding, I want to encourage all of the listeners here to listen to Simon's interview on hidden forces because he goes into, I love that episode, by the way. He spent about an hour describing what it's like to be 20 years old and go through the Soviet process of getting out and basically having no assurance, huge risk. You could have been a citizen of nowhere. You could have been imprisoned. There's a lot of it's a lot riskier than it sounds like. It's not just being at the airport with $100. There was much more to it, and it's a fascinating story.
Just again, to be honest, I didn't think of it this way because I was too young and stupid. I mean, now looking back, that I'm 64 and I'm looking at having done all that, I'm like, boy, that was cutting it close. But that was aggressive, very aggressive. But at the time, when you're 20, you don't see these things that way. The people who really took the risk were my parents. I mean, they really took the risk. But as my father always said, when my mother said, like, why are you doing this? We have jobs, we have friends, we have whatever. He said, I need to take my grandchildren out of here. And my mother says, what grandchildren? He's 18 years old. He doesn't, they're no, well, one day there will be grandchildren and I don't want them to be here. And so, yes, my two daughters are in business with me and I have a grandchild. And so my father's vision, I guess, had come to pass.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I just want one final question. Just in light of the framework that we just went through, which is it's a very complex framework and maybe pessimistic, what is your recommendation for sort of ordinary American families? In light of the risk that you articulated here for dynamic changes to happen in the financial system and maybe devastating changes, what should ordinary American families be thinking about and how can they protect themselves?
This is very complicated because it depends on obviously personal circumstances and whether a person has income or whether they need the portfolio to generate income on which they live. My personal solution, and I'm not advocating it to anybody, I think gold is a reserve asset. But whether it's gold or whether it's some other possibilities, I think the one thing that's been lost in the era of financialization, which, by the way, the word financialization I use to describe a situation where real economy is optimized to the highest asset prices and financial outcomes as opposed to real outcomes, in terms of production and consumption, things like that. I mean, I would say that the concept of reserves is a pivotal concept that has been lost. Preparedness. Pericles, Athenian politician, there's a quote ascribed to him that the key is not to predict the future, but to prepare for it. And so we've lost that culture. I mean, it was a culture of, that's where the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts came from after World War One. This concept that things can happen and we need to be prepared. We've lost that culture. We used to have in this country and the Soviet Union, I mean, it used to be civil defense drills every whatever month. And people had to know where the bomb shelter was and so forth. In Switzerland, you can't even build a property unless you either build a bomb shelter in your property, a house, or you need to pay a communal charge for a bomb shelter in your community, whichever community has a bomb shelter. So that mentality, I'm not saying we need bomb shelters. I said that's mentality of preparedness, of having something set aside for the rainy day. I think we have lost that because there's a concept now, people say, my money needs to work. We're putting the money to work. Money needs to work. You know what? Money doesn't always need to work because wealth is created and destroyed usually in spurts. It's not an everyday thing. And so it's important to avoid those spurts where it gets destroyed. Because just like on that transcosmic journey, if you're 30 years into it and you have 10 years left, and suddenly you find out you're in the wrong place and you're 30 years away from your destination where you thought it was only 10, that's a big wake-up call. And it's the same thing here. So I'm not being very precise, and I wish I could be, but I'd say people should have reserves. People should own some gold. People should own some silver. People should own, if they own their house, maybe they should have less debt on it. Maybe if they have a car, they should have to pay off the debt on the car so that they own things. Those things do not get destroyed. Those things survive through the financial debacle. If you can carry through your health and your family and some resources, sufficient resources, like whether it's in the form of gold, whether it's some cash, and maybe some, some pantry with some food. It's not prepper stuff. It's just basic common sense. That's as best as you can do. And yes, maybe you should be less on the market during some times or these times and more in something where you can liquidate it faster than otherwise. But it's very difficult in a financialized system to completely check out. I mean, I own a lot of gold. I don't recommend that to people. I feel like may not have any upside, but it certainly is not going to vaporize. Like a lot of other things I think are going to vaporize. Not because the underlying real assets are going to disappear, but because the claims to them are going to disappear. Like the buildings in New York City are going to be there. The question is, who owns them before it's all over? That's the key. The world is not going away. It's the ownership. It's the value of the ownership that's going to change. And who owns these things is what's going to change. So what we're talking about here is not physical Armageddon. We're talking about a major reallocate, like the Great Depression. And being able to make through that, it's your community, it's prudence with your affairs, it's not having a lot of debt, and it's doing basic things and probably owning some gold and silver and maybe, I don't know, some other things that can be useful to a generator or whatever. Basic things for insurance. And now is the time to do it because by the time everybody figured it out, you're not going to get a generator. Everybody buys generator after the snowstorm. I don't know if you noticed that. After the snowstorm, no generators. Before the snowstorm, generators and snow plows, no problem. So the time to stock up is before people want it.
Yeah, it was like toilet paper during COVID.
But the important thing about toilet paper and about gold and about all these other things, it's not like, and then you can't get any because it doesn't exist. It's just logistics. Yeah, sure, there are plenty of trees in Minnesota. They're going to cut them down eventually. There's going to be more toilet paper. But I need to go to the bathroom now. So that's not going to help me. So that's the important is to have the spoon is dear at dinner time. So have what you need for when it's important to have, not later.
Well said. Well, Simon, thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you if they want to follow your thinking and your ideas?
We have a website. It's called bullionreserve.com and another website that's called bullionsource.us. And I'm on Twitter at S_Mikhailovich. If you just Google me, you're going to find me.
Thank you so much for your time, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Nick Hilera Show. We hope you enjoyed the episode and would appreciate your help with spreading the word by sharing with your network on social. And until next time, remember, it's not about pursuing success to unlock fulfillment. It's about learning how to find fulfillment in the midst of success.